They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors start erasing the ink? Across America, museum shelves are quietly emptying. Exhibit plaques vanish overnight. Photographs fade, not from time, but from policy. Under the Trump administration's new directives, entire chapters of our shared story are being dismantled, piece by piece, until the gaps themselves become the narrative. This series is our counterweight. We will step into the silence left behind, unearth the artifacts, the voices, the truths that are being swept from public view. From war heroes to cultural trailblazers, from painful reckonings to proud triumphs, these are the stories they don't want you to remember. History isn't just a record, it's a warning. And if we let it vanish, we might not see what's coming next. They can pull artifacts from the glass, strike names from the plaques, delete the photographs. But what they cannot erase is the truth that lingers in the silence. The more they erase, the louder we remember.
Imagine a world where freedom is a dream, where you are simply property to be bought, sold, and controlled. Picture the first Africans arriving in the English colonies, not as settlers, but as captives, their fates sealed by chains, labor, and laws designed to strip them of humanity. This is the story of slavery in America, as chronicled by George Washington Williams in his groundbreaking work, History of the Negro Race in America, covering the period from 1619 to 1880. The year was 1619. A ship bearing 20 enslaved Africans docked at Jamestown, Virginia. At first, the English settlers debated whether these men and women would be treated as indentured servants or slaves. The distinction was subtle at first. Some Africans worked for a set term before gaining freedom, but within decades, the distinction vanished entirely. Laws hardened, and the condition of Negroes became permanent, hereditary, and inescapable. Children inherited the status of their mothers, ensuring a self-perpetuating system of bondage. Life under slavery was brutal and relentless. Enslaved people were stripped of rights, forbidden to learn to read or write, and subjected to relentless labor from sunrise to sunset. Yet, even in this darkness, culture persisted. Stories, songs, and whispered legends traveled through the fields and quarters, preserving memory, hope, and a sense of identity in a society determined to erase it. Williams tells of men and women who resisted, through escape, rebellion, and subtle acts of defiance that challenged the very foundations of colonial power. Economic greed fueled the expansion of slavery. Tobacco in Virginia, rice in South Carolina, and sugar in the Caribbean demanded labor beyond the capacity of indentured servants. Enslaved Africans became the engine of a transatlantic economy, their suffering hidden behind plantation walls, but foundational to the wealth of the colonies. Harsh punishments, restrictive laws, and the ever-present threat of family separation created a climate of fear, yet also of extraordinary resilience. The legal codification of slavery intensified. By the early 18th century, colonial assemblies passed laws that made the slaveholders' property rights absolute. An enslaved person could be whipped, sold, or executed with little recourse, while any attempt at revolt was met with swift and lethal punishment. Williams details incidents of rebellion, from small acts of sabotage to larger insurrections, showing that even in the most controlled environments, the desire for freedom was unstoppable. Williams also examines the complicity of society at large. Slavery was not only enforced by the plantations, but by the courts, churches, and merchants who profited from the trade. The moral compromises and rationalizations required to sustain the system reveal a society willing to dehumanize others for economic gain, a reality that left scars on generations and shaped the emerging nation in profound ways. Yet, amidst this oppression, humanity persisted. African customs, music, and storytelling survived and evolved, blending with the American landscape to create a culture that could not be entirely suppressed. Williams' account reminds us that history is not merely a record of suffering, but a testament to courage, endurance, and the refusal to be erased. The story of slavery in the colonies is not just a tale of oppression, it is a chronicle of resilience, of the ways in which people claim dignity under impossible circumstances. As we trace these narratives, Williams forces us to confront both the horrors inflicted and the indomitable spirit of those who lived through them, a story that echoes across centuries, shaping America in ways that are still felt today. Chapter 12, The Colony of Virginia.
Virginia was the mother of slavery as well as the mother of presidents. Unfortunate for her, unfortunate for the other colonies, and thrice unfortunate for the poor colored people, who from 1619 to 1863 yielded their liberty, their toil, unrequited, their bodies and intellects to an institution that ground them to powder. No event in the history of North America has carried with it to its last analysis such terrible forces. It touched the brightest features of social life, and they faded under the contact of its poisonous breath. George Washington Williams.
Often called the Mother of Presidents, Virginia holds another, far darker title, the birthplace of American slavery. It began in the sweltering late summer of 1619, when a Dutch ship arrived on Virginia's shores carrying 20 Africans. Some records hint it may have been 1618, when the ship treasurer delivered enslaved people under the command of Captain Argall. Whatever the exact date, a system of human bondage had taken root, a system that would haunt the colony for centuries. It should be noted that the Virginia colony did not actively seek out these slaves, they were essentially forced upon them. The slaves were brought in exchange for food given to feed starving sailors. At the same time, white servitude was widespread, and many of the colony's white laborers were convicts sent from England. The intense demand for labor may have dulled the colonists' moral awareness of the grave injustice in which they were participating. Women were sold as wives, and some were even kidnapped in England and sent to the colony. From the very beginning, there was nothing in the colony's moral climate to oppose the institution of bondage. England itself had long maintained various forms of servitude: villains in the feudal era, kidnapped Africans under Elizabeth and the Tudor monarchs, European children working in mines and factories, and conquered Brahmins in its eastern colonies. Given this background, it is perhaps unsurprising that the so-called knights and adventurers of Virginia, preoccupied with maintaining privilege, continued this long history of dehumanization. At first, their numbers were small, 22 by 1624, but the seeds had been sown. Over decades, the population grew steadily, 300 by 1648, 2,000 by 1671, and over 100,000 by 1758. Each law passed tightened the chains, each custom enforced their dehumanization. In 1662, Virginia declared that children inherited their mother's enslaved status. Slavery was now not just legal, but hereditary.
All servants not being Christians imported into this colony by shipping shall be slaves for their lives. An act to repeal a former law making Indians and others free. General Assembly of Virginia, 1682.
The laws drew clear lines. Enslaved Africans and Native Americans were denied property, political power, and even the right to bear arms. Intermarriage with whites was forbidden. Education was discouraged. Free black people fared little better, taxed but voiceless, often forced to leave the colony if granted freedom. The church, largely indifferent, offered only minimal spiritual guidance, leaving the enslaved isolated, controlled, and exploited. Yet slavery was not just a moral and social crime, it became the backbone of Virginia's economy. Tobacco cultivation demanded labor, and the colony profited, legislated, and codified this labor into a rigid, hereditary system. Over time, slavery grew from a marginal practice into a central institution, sanctioned by law, enforced by custom, and defended by those who benefited from it.
The slaves in this colony had no political or military rights. As early as 1639, the Assembly excused them from owning or carrying arms, and in 1705 they were barred by a special act from holding or exercising any office, ecclesiastical, civil, or military, or any place of public trust or power in the colony. If found with a gun, sword, club, staff, or other weapon, they were turned over to the constable, who was required to administer 20 lashes on his or her bare back. Slaves were not allowed to leave the plantation on which they were held as chattel or real estate without a written certificate or pass from their master, which was only granted under the most urgent circumstances. If they dared lift a hand against any white man, or Christian as they loved to call themselves, they were punished by 30 lashes, and if a slave dared to resist his master while he was correcting him, he could be killed, and the master would be guiltless in the eyes of the law. George Washington Williams.
By the mid-18th century, the enslaved population had become integral to Virginia's wealth and identity. Their suffering was silent, invisible to the white colonists who celebrated freedom and progress, yet the colony's triumphs were inseparable from their pain. Slavery's dark roots had taken hold, and its shadow would stretch far beyond the Revolution, shaping the destiny of a new nation while leaving millions without liberty, justice, or a voice. Chapter 13. The Colony of New York. Part 1. Slavery.
An urgent and extraordinary demand for labor, rather than the cruel desire to traffic in human beings, led the Dutch to encourage the bringing of Negro slaves. Scattered widely among the whites, treated often with the humanity that characterized the treatment bestowed upon the white servants, there was little said about slaves in this period. The majority of them were employed upon the farms and led quiet and sober lives. George Washington Williams.
When the Dutch first settled New Netherland in 1609, slavery quietly became part of the colony's fabric. The early records are sparse, but the need for labor was urgent. Farms, roads, and households required strong hands, yet white servants were scarce and costly. The West India Company, with holdings in Brazil and the African coast, provided a steady stream of enslaved Africans. These men, women, and children were scattered across the colony, working the land, building infrastructure, and serving in homes. While some resisted and caused alarm, many lived under a relatively mild system. Slaves could marry, celebrate festivals, and even gain manumission, though their children often remained in bondage, a practice some Dutch colonists openly condemned as unjust.
It is gratifying to find the recorded indignation of some of the best citizens of the New Netherlands against the enslaving of the children of free Negroes. It was severely denounced as contrary to justice and in violation of the law of nature. How anyone born of a free Christian mother could, notwithstanding, be a slave and be obliged to remain such, passed their comprehension. George Washington Williams.
Life under the Dutch was patriarchal. Slaves could manage small plots of land, participate in social life, and practice their religion. Their servitude was harsh at times, yet it was tempered by a sense of moral obligation and community. Slavery was practical rather than cruel, a means to meet the colony's labor demands, not a system designed for exploitation. Everything changed in 1664, when the English seized New Netherland and renamed it New York. The mild patriarchal Dutch system gave way to English laws that codified slavery with rigor.
At the first, the Negro slave was regarded as a cheap laborer, a blessing to the province, but after a while the cupidity of the English induced the Hollanders to regard the Negro as a coveted, marketable chattel. George Washington Williams.
The Duke of York's laws of 1665, modelled on Massachusetts' legal code, recognised bond labour, and subsequent legislation cemented it. Freed slaves were denied land, and enslaved Africans faced strict curfews, harsh punishments, and severe restrictions on gatherings. The Royal African Company, encouraged by Queen Anne, ensured a steady supply of slaves, entwining the growth of slavery with the colony's economic and religious ambitions. By 1710, New York's municipal government even established a slave market at the foot of Wall Street, a grim symbol of human lives reduced to property. Laws forbade freed slaves from owning land, leaving few paths to independence. Religious instruction and baptism offered no escape. Spiritual equality did not translate to legal or economic freedom.
Though emancipated from the bondage of Satan, he nevertheless remained the abject slave of the Christian colonists. Claiming spiritual kinship with Christ, the Negro could be sold at the pleasure of his master, and his family hearthstone trodden down by the slave dealer. George Washington Williams.
The colony's enslaved population grew restless under these conditions. In 1712, a revolt erupted. Houses were burned, lives were lost, and the city's authorities feared widespread chaos. The uprising revealed the tension and injustice embedded in a system that denied basic human rights while demanding obedience. From their early semi-autonomous lives under the Dutch to the tightly controlled, legally codified bondage under the English, the enslaved in New York experienced a brutal transformation. What began as a pragmatic labor solution became an institution that crushed family bonds, restricted education, and enforced absolute control over body and spirit. By the early 18th century, slavery had not only taken root in New York, but had grown into a harsh and unyielding system, a grim testament to the ambitions and avarice of colonial powers, and a stark reminder of the human cost behind the city's early prosperity.
The humane feature of the system of slavery under the simple Dutch government of allowing slaves to acquire an interest in the soil was now at an end. The tendency to manumit faithful slaves called forth no approbation. The colonists grew cold and hard-fisted. They saw not God's image in the slave, only so many dollars. There was little in this world to allure him, to encourage him, to help him. The institution under which he suffered was one huge sepulcher, and he was buried alive. George Washington Williams.
Part 2. The Negro Plot.
The Negro Plot of 1741 furnishes the most interesting and thrilling chapter in the history of the colony of New York. Unfortunately for the truth of history, there was but one historian of the affair, and he an interested judge, and what he has written should be taken cum grano salis. His book was intended to defend the action of the court that destroyed so many innocent lives, but no man can read it without being thoroughly convinced that the decision of the court was both illogical and cruel. There is nothing in this country to equal it, except it be the burning of the witches at Salem. George Washington Williams.
In May 1741, New York City was gripped by panic over a supposed conspiracy to burn the town. Fires had broken out mysteriously, prompting public fasting and widespread fear. The scandal escalated after the arrests and trials of John Hewson, his family, and several enslaved Africans. Mary Burton, a young servant, became the star witness, her accusations treated as indisputable truth. Even children and the mentally disabled were interrogated and coerced into implicating others, often under the threat of execution. Enslaved people were systematically tortured for confessions, and those who resisted were executed. Quack and Cuffy, already condemned, were forced to confess Hewson's orchestration of the fires in exchange for a temporary reprieve, only to be burned at the stake. Over weeks, terrified witnesses, primarily enslaved individuals, accused one another, as well as white townspeople, including teachers and a reputed Catholic priest, John Urey. The courts, eager to affirm a conspiracy, ignored contradictory testimony and procedural fairness, denying defendants counsel and disregarding evidence of innocence. Trials were swift and cruel. Accusations snowballed and new arrests followed each coerced confession. Sarah Hewson, Hewson's daughter, and others were repeatedly summoned to testify. The hysteria extended to white citizens accused by Burton and William Kane. Despite many witnesses affirming the accused's innocence, courts relied on coerced or fabricated testimony. Urey, a schoolmaster and clergyman, was convicted largely on the word of Burton and Kane, despite demonstrating his innocence and offering witnesses to vouch for his character. He was hanged on August 29th, 1741. By the end of the summer, 154 enslaved Africans were jailed. 14 were burned, 18 hanged, 71 transported, and the rest pardoned. 24 whites were imprisoned, 4 executed, and the remainder released. The trials exposed systemic injustice. Enslaved people were denied counsel, sworn under duress, and tried on contradictory, often fantastical evidence. Mary Burton, who orchestrated many of the accusations, received monetary reward for her role. The aftermath left the enslaved population in New York under even harsher restrictions. Laws curtailed their rights, reinforcing a regime of fear and control. The episode, remembered as the Negro Plot of 1741, stands as a stark example of mass hysteria inflamed by prejudice, religious intolerance, and judicial abuse. Despite the chaos and tragedy, the courage and resilience of the city's enslaved population would resurface decades later during the Revolutionary War, when African Americans leveraged their valor to challenge the very oppression that had fueled the Panic of 1741. Chapter 14: The Colony of Massachusetts.
The records of the most remote period of colonial history have preserved a silence on the question of Negro slavery as ominous as it is conspicuous. George Washington Williams.
They called themselves champions of liberty. The Puritans of Massachusetts crossed an ocean to escape tyranny, to build a city upon a hill where freedom could shine before the world. Yet, hidden beneath their lofty ideals was a silence, an uncomfortable silence, about slavery. And it is in that silence that one of America's oldest contradictions was born. The records are thin, sometimes only fragments, as though the Puritans themselves wanted history to forget. But if we listen closely, we can still hear the faint echoes. In 1633, an odd story made its way into the chronicles. A band of Indians stumbled upon what they thought was a devil perched in a tree. It wasn't the devil at all. It was an African man, lost and wandering, only to be dragged back to his master. That brief tale tells us what the Puritans would not write openly. Slavery already lived in Massachusetts. The truth became undeniable just a few years later, during the Pequot War of 1637. The English found their Indian captives unmanageable, too proud, too rebellious. So they shipped them off to Bermuda, and in return brought back Africans who, it was believed, would endure the yoke with more submission.
As the Pequot Indians would not endure the yoke, would not remain as servants, they were sent to Bermudas and exchanged for Negroes, with the hope that the latter would endure the yoke more patiently. The first importation of slaves from Barbados, secured in exchange for Indians, was made in 1637, the first year of the Pequot War, and was doubtless kept up for many years. George Washington Williams.
That same year, the ship Desire, built in Marblehead, set sail to the West Indies and returned with enslaved people. By 1639, the Massachusetts General Court was already approving payments for their keep. What began as scattered practice had already hardened into policy. Then came the law that would change everything. In 1641, the Puritans passed the first legal code established in New England.
It is ordered by this court, and the authority thereof, that there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, as willingly sell themselves, or are sold to us. And such shall have the liberties and Christian usage which the law of God established in Israel concerning such persons doth morally require, provided this exempts none from servitude, who shall be judged thereto by authority. Massachusetts Body of Liberties, 1641.
And there it was. In one neat paragraph, Massachusetts both outlawed slavery and made it perfectly legal. For the next century and a half, men and women would live and die in bondage under the sanction of both church and state. The numbers tell the story of a quiet but steady growth. By 1676, there were around 200 slaves in the colony. By 1708, more than 500. By the 1750s, nearly 5,000 souls lived in bondage. They were listed in the tax rolls like horses and hogs. In Boston newspapers, enslaved girls were advertised alongside furniture and stays, their lives reduced to merchandise. Infants could be torn from mothers' arms, sold off before they even knew how to walk.
Negro children were considered an encumbrance in a family, and when weaned, were given away like puppies. Dr. Jeremy Belknap, founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society.
The courts too played their part. They declared that the child of a slave woman was property, not person, born not free but already owned. To resist this cruel arithmetic, many enslaved men sought out Indian wives because children born of Indian mothers were not bound. It was a desperate strategy, a bid for family and for freedom, but one forever at the mercy of the law. Slave marriages themselves carried no protection. A family could be broken apart with the stroke of a master's pen. And yet, Massachusetts liked to think of itself as more righteous than the South. In 1645, the General Court even made a show of condemning man-stealing, ordering kidnapped Africans to be returned home. But this was no sweeping rejection of slavery. It was a defense of proper commerce. Purchase your human beings lawfully. Do not simply steal them. With that veneer of morality, Boston's merchants plunged headlong into the slave trade until the city became one of its busiest ports. The Puritans spoke often of freedom. They quoted scripture, raised their children to honor God, and dreamed of a land where tyranny had no home. But when it came to their African neighbors, they found ways to look away. They convinced themselves that slavery was sanctioned by law, justified by religion, and necessary for prosperity. And so, in the very colony that claimed to light the world with liberty, slavery struck its roots deep into the soil. It would remain there, festering, until revolution shook the land, and even then, the scar would not heal.
During this period, the social condition of the Negroes, bond and free, was very deplorable. With but small means, the free Negroes of the colony were unable to secure many comforts in their homes. They were hated and dreaded more than their brethren in bondage. They could judge, by contrast, of the abasing influences of slavery. They were only nominally free, because they were taxed without representation, had no voice in the colonial government. George Washington Williams.
In colonial America, black men and women who were no longer enslaved still lived under the shadow of laws that bound their lives. The Act of 1705 declared that no Christian could marry a Negro. Ministers who dared unite them faced a crushing fine of £50, a law that remained in force until 1843. Even baptism into the church, a symbol of salvation, brought no protection. Baptized or not, free or slave, the Negro remained shut out from the rights of a freeman. Free people of color carried the heaviest of ironies. They owned their labor, but not their liberty. Laws treated them little better than slaves. They could not gather in numbers greater than 3 without white supervision. They could not host enslaved friends without permission. They were required to answer fire alarms and perform labor for the militia, yet were denied the rights of those they served beside. If they failed to pay fines, they were thrown into the House of Correction and forced to work them off under brutal discipline. And if a black man so much as struck a white, the punishment was swift and public, the lash. Their world was one of deprivation. No schools, no churches, no books, only the silence of laws designed to smother their voices. John Eliot, the missionary who had worked so passionately with native peoples, lamented that Africans were treated no better than cattle. He tried, with all the strength he had left, to gather slaves once a week to teach them the catechism. But his death brought those efforts to an end. And yet, even in this barren soil, flowers grew. One of them was a frail little girl brought from Africa in 1761, wearing nothing but a piece of tattered cloth. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley. Purchased by a Boston family, she astonished her mistress with her quick mind. Within 18 months, she was reading the most difficult passages of the Bible. Within 4 years, she was writing letters and poems that captivated the city's intellectual elite. She mastered English, delved into Latin, and even translated Ovid. At just 20 years old, she published a book of poetry in London that carried her name across 2 continents.
From a state of nudity in a slave market, a stranger to the English language, this young African girl had won her way over the rough path of learning, had conquered the spirit of caste in the best society of conservative old Boston, had brought 2 continents to her feet in admiration and amazement at the rare poetical accomplishments of a child of Africa. George Washington Williams.
Phyllis Wheatley charmed scholars, preachers, and politicians. Even George Washington received a poem from her hand. In a letter, the general confessed that her poetical talents nearly compelled him to publish her work himself. She had carried herself from the slave market to the drawing rooms of London society, breaking barriers no law could contain. And she was not the only one. John Cuff, once enslaved, purchased his freedom and built a prosperous farm on the Massachusetts coast. He raised children who carried forward his legacy, including Paul Cuff, who would become one of the most remarkable black leaders of the era. Another boy, taught Greek by his master, could read classical texts as fluently as any scholar. Each of these stories whispered the same dangerous truth, that slavery's chains were not forged from nature, but from fear. For every Phyllis Wheatley who wrote poetry, for every John Cuff who built a farm, the myth of black inferiority cracked a little more. As the revolution approached, those cracks spread. Pamphlets, sermons, and fiery speeches began to ask the question that could no longer be avoided. How could a people crying for liberty from Britain continue to hold slaves in America? Chapter 15. The Colony of Massachusetts continued.
I wish most sincerely there was not a slave in the province. It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. Mrs. John Adams, the 22nd of September, 1774.
By the mid-1700s, slavery in Massachusetts was no longer just a tolerated shadow at the edges of society. It had become a problem too big to ignore, a contradiction too loud to silence. Once dismissed as a minor institution, it had grown into something entrenched, a parasite feeding on the colony's wealth while poisoning its claim to liberty. Legislators began to see it as a danger, politically, morally, even spiritually, and the calls for abolition grew louder.
The time to urge legislation on the slavery question had come. Cultivated at the first as a private enterprise, then fostered as a patriarchal institution, slavery had grown to such gigantic proportions as to be regarded as an unwieldy evil and subversive of the political stability of the colony. Men winked at the day of its small things, and it grew. Little legislation was required to regulate it, and it began to take root in the social and political life of the people. The necessities for legislation in favor of slavery increased. Every year witnessed the enactment of laws more severe, until they appeared as scars upon the body of the laws of the colony. To erase these scars was the duty of the hour. George Washington Williams.
It started with whispers. In 1755, the town of Salem petitioned against the importation of slaves. Worcester followed 10 years later, calling the practice unchristian and impolitic. And then Boston, never one to hold its tongue, instructed its representatives in 1766 to go further, abolition itself. These weren't isolated voices anymore. They were part of a growing chorus, especially in the coastal towns where commerce and news flowed most freely. By 1767, that chorus had reached the floor of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. A bill was introduced, not just to halt the trade, but to prohibit slavery altogether. For a moment, it seemed possible, but politics, as always, muddied the waters. Amendments weakened the proposal until it became little more than a tax on imported slaves, a half measure that satisfied no one and left the institution intact. The hypocrisy was impossible to miss. Colonial leaders thundered about liberty from Britain while refusing liberty to the people they held in bondage. The more they spoke of rights and freedom, the more glaring their own chains appeared. In 1771, another chance arrived. The House passed a bill to end the slave trade. Governor Hutchinson rejected it, claiming he had no authority from Parliament. General Gage later used the same excuse. Again, the doors to change slammed shut. Frustrated, towns took matters into their own hands. Salem, Leicester, Medford, Sandwich, one after another they sent petitions demanding not just an end to the trade, but freedom for the children of enslaved parents. These were arguments steeped in the very language of the Revolution: natural rights, liberty, the hypocrisy of preaching freedom while denying it. While towns petitioned on their behalf, the enslaved themselves began to seize the law as a weapon.
The Negroes of Massachusetts were not mere passive observers of the benevolent conduct of their white friends. They were actively interested in the agitation going on in their behalf. Here, as in no other colony, the Negroes showed themselves equal to the emergencies that arose and capable of appreciating the opportunities to strike for their own rights. The Negroes in the colony at length struck a blow for their liberty. They had learned to spell out the letters of freedom, and the meaning of the word had quite ravished their fainting souls. George Washington Williams.
As early as 1766, John Adams recorded the case of a woman suing for her freedom. Others followed: Jenny Slew, Amos Newport, James of Cambridge. One by one, they walked into courtrooms and asked the question Massachusetts leaders were trying to avoid: is slavery even legal here? Some juries said yes, granting freedom. Others clung to the idea of property in man. But with every case, the cracks in the system widened. By the 1770s, enslaved people were not just suing, they were organizing. In 1773, Felix Holbrook and others petitioned the legislature, asking for nothing less than emancipation and land to live upon. The Assembly referred it to committee, and there it died. Undeterred, they petitioned again the next year. This time, the legislature responded, passing another bill against the slave trade in 1774. And once again, the governor refused to sign. It was the same story again and again. Every effort to end the trade or abolish slavery met the same fate: blocked, delayed, dissolved. Yet those failures had consequences. Because each time a royal governor refused, he tied the defense of slavery to the authority of Britain itself. And each time enslaved men and women rose up with their petitions, their lawsuits, or their unrest, they forced the colony to stare into its own hypocrisy. So when the revolution finally arrived, the battles for independence and the battles against slavery could no longer be separated. In Massachusetts, the struggle for liberty and the struggle against bondage had become one and the same. Chapter 16, The Colony of Maryland.
Like Virginia, the colony of Maryland found the soil rich and the cultivation of tobacco a profitable enterprise. The country was new, and the physical obstructions in the way of civilization numerous and formidable. Of course, all could not pursue the one path that led to agriculture. Mechanic and trade folk were in great demand. Laborers were scarce, and the few that could be obtained commanded high wages. The Negro slave's labor could be made as cheap as his master's conscience and heart were small. Cheaper labor became the cry on every hand, and the Negro was the desire of nearly all white men in the colony. George Washington Williams.
Up until the summer of 1630, the land we now call Maryland was not Maryland at all. It was simply an outlying corner of Virginia, subject to her laws and her rule. But within just a few years, a new colony would emerge, eager to define itself, and in doing so, it planted the first faint seeds of an institution that would shape its destiny for generations: slavery. In 1637, Maryland's First Assembly gathered and drafted a series of bills. They came to nothing, mere words on paper, never becoming law. Yet among them was one that spoke volumes, a bill for the punishment of ill servants. At first glance, it sounds like a simple matter of discipline, but in that day, the word servant carried a double meaning. White laborers, bound for a term of years, and Africans, bound for life, were both called by the same name. Slavery was present in Maryland from the very beginning, but it was small in scale, almost hidden beneath this ambiguous label. Only later, as bondage expanded, would the softer word servant fall away, leaving the blunt truth, slave. A year later, in 1638, another set of laws appeared. One declared that all Christian inhabitants, slaves only excepted, shall enjoy the rights of Englishmen. It was a single phrase, almost a footnote, but it carried enormous weight. By granting liberty to Christians and excluding enslaved Africans, the Assembly drew a sharp line. Freedom was for some. For others, chains were their permanent inheritance. Even baptism could not erase that mark. Negroes, whether heathen or baptized Christians, were not recognized as equals before law, church, or state. By 1663, Maryland no longer spoke in hints or evasions. That year, the colony passed its first sweeping slave law. Every Negro within the province would serve for life. Every child born of enslaved parents would inherit bondage as naturally as breathing. And in an act meant to shame and punish, any freeborn Englishwoman who dared marry an enslaved man would herself become a servant for the duration of her husband's life, and their children would be slaves forever. It was not just a law of labor. It was a law of blood, binding generations to chains before they had even drawn their first breath.
Maryland made a slave code, which, for cruelty and general inhumanity, has no equal in the South. George Washington Williams.
Why such laws? The answer lay in tobacco. The soil was rich, the profits immense, but the work was brutal and unending. Free laborers were scarce and expensive. Enslaved Africans offered a solution that was as cheap as the consciences of those who purchased them. Soon, the cry of the planters was not for freedom, not for justice, but for cheaper labor. Maryland answered that call with law after law that entrenched slavery deeper into its soil. By the early 1700s, the colony had forged a code so cruel it shocked even by the standards of the age. Laws that allowed mutilation, execution, and public displays of terror to keep enslaved people in line. freedom itself became a dangerous idea, so tightly chained that even an owner's wish to free a faithful servant was often forbidden by law.
For the Negro, this was one long, starless night of oppression and outrage. George Washington Williams.
By mid-century, the scale of it was staggering. Tens of thousands of Africans had been brought across the ocean, their labor driving Maryland's prosperity. Convicts from Britain, shipped over by the hundreds, often became slave owners themselves, hardening their hearts with cruelty to prove they were above the men and women they once labored beside. Religious prejudice added another layer of oppression, with Irish Catholics taxed and shunned while Negroes were bound in chains. And yet, even in this world of darkness, hope refused to die.
Suffice it now to say that cruel and hurtful, unjust and immoral as the institution of slavery was, it had not robbed the Negro of a lofty conception of the fundamental principles that inspired white men to resist the arrogance of England, nor did it impair his enthusiasm in the cause that gave birth to a new republic amid the shock of embattled arms. George Washington Williams.
As whispers of revolution stirred, enslaved men and women listened. They heard talk of liberty, of natural rights, of defiance against a distant king. And though the words were not meant for them, they understood their meaning all too well. For them, the revolution was not only about stamps and taxes, but about a dream far more daring, the dream that one day freedom might belong to them too. Chapter 17, The Colony of Delaware. Before Delaware was Delaware, its soil was touched by Swedes and Danes. They were few in number, but bold enough to make a remarkable declaration. It was not lawful, they said, to buy and keep slaves. For a moment, it seemed this small colony might chart a different path, but history rarely bends so easily. The Dutch soon swept in, claiming the territory for themselves, and when New Netherland passed to the Duke of York, Delaware passed with it. In 1682, the land was handed over to William Penn, though by 1703 its counties demanded a measure of independence. Yet long before charters and legislatures, the shadow of slavery had already crossed the Delaware. As early as 1636, records show 3 Africans purchased into bondage, working not for the colony, but for private service. A few years later, complaints arose that colonists were using the company's oxen and Negroes. By 1661, negotiations between Marylanders and Dutchmen openly included a chilling clause: 3,000 hogsheads of tobacco each year in exchange for Negroes and other commodities. The traffic in human lives was already entrenched. The law soon followed.
The first legislation on the slavery question in the colony of Delaware was had in 1721. An act for the trial of Negroes provided that 2 justices and 6 freeholders should have full power to try Negro and mulatto slaves for heinous offenses. In case slaves were executed, the assembly paid the owner 2/3 the value of such slave. It forbade convocations of slaves and made it a misdemeanor to carry arms. During the same year, an act was passed punishing adultery and fornication. In case of children of a white woman by a slave, the county court bound them out until they were 31 years of age. George Washington Williams.
Enslaved men and women could be condemned by 2 justices and 6 freeholders. If executed, their owners were compensated for the loss, as if the condemned were livestock. The law forbade gatherings, outlawed weapons, and bound children of white women and enslaved fathers into servitude until the age of 31. Over the years, the chains tightened further. Laws of 1739 and 1767 made freedom itself nearly impossible, requiring bonds so costly that manumission was a dream few could reach. In Delaware, as in so many colonies, the enslaved were denied every right.
The remainder of the slave code in this colony was like unto those of the other colonies, and therefore need not be described. Negroes had no rights, ecclesiastical or political. They had no property, nor could they communicate a relation of any character. They had no religious or secular training, and none of the blessings of home life. George Washington Williams.
They were stripped of property, education, family, and faith, and yet their silence was never complete. A growl of defiance here, a murmur of resistance there, small sounds that haunted their master's sleep, reminders that even in chains, the human spirit refused to die. Chapter 18, The Colony of Connecticut.
Although the colony of Connecticut was founded between the years 1631 and 1636, there are to be found no reliable data by which to fix the time of the introduction of slavery there. Like the serpent's entrance into the Garden of Eden, slavery entered into this colony stealthily, and its power for evil was discovered only when it had become a formidable social and political element. Negroes were bought as laborers and domestics, and it was a long time before their number called for special legislation. But, like a cancer, slavery grew until there was not a single colony in North America that could boast of its ability to check the dreadful curse. When the first slaves were introduced into this colony can never be known, but that there were Negro slaves from the beginning, we have the strongest historical presumption. For nearly 2 decades, there was no reference made to slavery in the records of the colony. George Washington Williams.
Slavery crept into Connecticut like a shadow, quiet, almost invisible at first, yet destined to shape lives and law for over a century. The colony, founded between 1631 and 1636, left no record of its first Negro slaves. Ships from Africa, the West Indies, and Barbados brought human cargo, and though law did not sanction it at first, custom quickly made it a reality. Slaves were few, scattered, and largely hidden, yet their presence whispered of a darkness growing beneath the surface of a fledgling colony. By 1680, authorities began to take note. Governor Leete reported that sometimes 3 or 4 slaves arrived each year from Barbados, sold at negotiated prices. Birth records of black children were sparse, yet even in these early years, the seeds of control were planted. Laws soon emerged, forbidding wandering slaves without passes, punishing those who spoke out, restricting freedom, and monitoring every move. The colony demanded obedience. Suspicion and fear shadowed every act of the enslaved. Yet amid oppression, a rare glimmer of humanity appeared. In 1702 and 1711, Connecticut required owners to provide for freed slaves and servants who could no longer support themselves, ensuring they would not be abandoned to destitution. Even as punishment and surveillance tightened, these measures acknowledged a faint spark of justice. By 1730, the colony held some 700 Indian and Negro slaves, watched, censured, and controlled by a society gripped by fear. They endured hardship, humiliation, and the constant threat of violence, but they endured. The Revolutionary era brought a moral mirror. White colonists fought for liberty while holding others in chains. This glaring contradiction stirred conscience and change.
Massachusetts had acted and did act very cowardly about this matter. But Connecticut showed great wisdom and humanity in making a just and equitable provision for such poor and decrepit slaves as might find themselves turned out to charity after a long life of unrequited toil. George Washington Williams.
By 1774, Connecticut took a decisive step. The colony passed a law forbidding the importation of slaves, a bold and concise stand against the institution.
No Indian, Negro, or mulatto slave shall at any time hereafter be brought or imported into this state by sea or land, from any place or places whatsoever, to be disposed of, left, or sold within this state. Connecticut Act for prohibiting the importation of Indian, Negro, or mulatto slaves, 1774.
The valor of Connecticut's black soldiers in the Revolutionary War proved their courage, their humanity, and the righteousness of freedom. Connecticut's story is one of cruelty and control, yes, but also of endurance, reflection, and the slow, stubborn triumph of justice over oppression.
The inconsistency of asking for freedom, praying for freedom, fighting for freedom, and dying for freedom when they themselves held thousands of human beings in bondage, the most cruel the world ever knew, helped the cause of the slave. Connecticut was the only one of the New England colonies that had the honesty and courage to legislate against slavery. And the patriotism and incomparable valor of the Negro soldiers of Connecticut, who proudly followed the Continental flag through the fires of the Revolutionary War, proved that they were worthy of the humane sentiment that demanded the Act of 1774. George Washington Williams.
Chapter 19. The Colony of Rhode Island.
Whereas there is a common course practiced amongst Englishmen to buy niggers, to that end they may have them for service or slaves forever. For the preventing of such practices among us, let it be ordered, that no black mankind or white being forced by covenant bond or otherwise, to serve any man or his assigns longer than 10 years, or until they come to be 24 years of age, if they've been taken in under 14, from the time of their coming within the liberties of this colony. And at the end or term of 10 years to set them free, as the manner is with the English servants. And that man that will not let them go free, or shall sell them away elsewhere, to that end that they may have been enslaved to others for a long time, he or they shall forfeit to the colony £40. Rhode Island General Court Act Against Slavery, passed the 19th of May, 1652.
Slavery in Rhode Island was born with the colony itself in 1647, and yet, just 5 years later, something remarkable happened. In 1652, the General Court passed a law, the first in the modern world, to forbid slavery. It should have been a revolution, but it wasn't. The law stayed on the books, and no one enforced it. Instead, slavery grew like a weed, quietly choking the colony for more than a century. The contradiction was staggering. Rhode Island's founders, visionaries in matters of liberty and faith, saw slavery as sin. They knew it, they said it, but knowing and doing are not the same.
The institution was established. Slaves were upon the farms, in the towns, and in the families of those who could afford to buy them. The population of the colony was small, and to manumit the slaves in whom much money was invested, or to suddenly cut off the supply from without, was more than the colonists felt able to perform. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. George Washington Williams.
By the early 1700s, the colony abandoned even the pretense. An impost tax was placed on imported slaves, turning human misery into revenue. Every man, woman, and child brought in from Africa was taxed £3. That money built roads, mended bridges, and paved the streets of Newport. Slavery, once outlawed, now funded the colony's growth. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. And yet resistance simmered. Enslaved men and women remembered the promise of that 1652 act. Some demanded their freedom after 10 years of service. Others slipped aboard ships, working as sailors and vanishing into the sea, chasing liberty on their own terms. Even a few sympathetic whites risked fines to offer kindness after curfew. Then came the Revolution. Rhode Islanders railed against British tyranny, demanding freedom, while thousands of their neighbors remained in chains. The irony was impossible to ignore.
The fires of the revolutionary struggle began to melt the frozen feelings of the colonists towards the slaves. When they began to feel the British lion clutching at the throat of their own liberties, the bondage of the Negro stared them in the face. They knew the Negro's power of endurance, his personal courage, his admirable promptitude in the performance of difficult tasks, and his desperate spirit when pressed too sharply. The thought of such an ally for the English army, such an element in their rear, was louder in their souls than the roar of the enemy's guns. George Washington Williams.
When the call to arms rang out, Black Rhode Islanders answered. They drilled, they marched, they fought. In their courage, the contradiction of slavery was laid bare. Rhode Island had once written the world's first anti-slavery law, but in the end, it wasn't law or conscience that broke the system. It was the enslaved themselves, resisting, escaping, fighting, and the fire of revolution that finally forced the colony to confront its own hypocrisy. In June 1774, Rhode Island passed an act prohibiting the importation of Negroes into this colony, and this time it stuck. For a time, enslaved Africans in Rhode Island experienced a brief easing of the harsh restrictions that had long defined their lives. The laws once enforced with iron severity began to loosen, and within that space, they found room to breathe, to listen, and to hope. They crowded into public gatherings, hungry for every word about the struggle for independence, their ears attuned to the fiery debates of their masters. And when war finally swept across the colonies, they were ready, not as distant observers, but as participants, eager to fight for the freedom of a land that had denied them their own. Chapter 20, The Colony of New Jersey. When the English seized control of New Jersey in 1664, the Duke of York handed authority to Berkeley and Carteret, and with them came the seeds of slavery. In the colony's earliest records, a chilling distinction appeared between servants for a term of years and servants for life, between those who would one day walk free and those who never would. White indentured servants on one side, black slaves on the other. No one can say for certain when slavery truly began in New Jersey, but it likely arrived quickly after its appearance in New Netherland. Dutch settlers, Quakers, and English colonists alike held enslaved Africans, though here the institution never spread with the same intensity as in the Deep South. Instead, enslaved people were scattered in small numbers across households, living within a system mild enough that few regulatory laws were deemed necessary. Still, by today's standards, the restrictions were harsh, the living conditions unthinkable. By 1675, anyone who harbored or transported runaways faced fines. Runaways were common, for many Africans torn from their homes and families had no roots to tie them to this strange land. Some wandered restlessly, searching for belonging. Along the coast, they gazed out at the ocean with desperate hope, their eyes fixed on the sails of ships that seemed to promise escape. For them, flight was not vice. It was the restless beating of a heart yearning for freedom.
They had no homes, no wives, no children, nothing to attach them to a locality. Those who resided near the seacoast watched, with unflagging interest, the coming and going of the mysterious white-winged vessels. They hung upon the storied lips of every fugitive and dreamed of lands afar where they might find that liberty for which their souls thirsted as the hart for the waterbrook. Far from their native country, without the blessings of the church or the warmth of substantial friendship, they fell into a listless condition, a somnolence that led them to stagger against some of the regulations of the province. Their wandering was not inspired by any subjective, inherent, generic evil. It was but the tossing of a weary, distressed mind under the dreadful influences of a hateful dream. And what little there is in the early records of the colony of New Jersey is at once a compliment to the humanity of the master and the docility of the slave. George Washington Williams.
When the colony split into East and West Jersey in 1676, their laws told two different stories. East Jersey's leaders cracked down, forbidding anyone from aiding fugitives or even trading with enslaved people, stripping away small chances for self-sufficiency. Yet in 1694, something remarkable happened. East Jersey granted enslaved Africans the right to trial by jury. It was the only place in North America where this existed. Elsewhere, a black person accused of a crime could be condemned to death with hardly a witness, no defense, and no chance at mercy. But in New Jersey, the law required a jury of 12 white colonists and 3 justices of the peace. For the enslaved, this faint glimmer of justice suggested that their lives might be valued as more than mere property. Across the river in West Jersey, the tone was different. The laws there declared
that all and every person and persons inhabiting the said province shall, as far as in us lies, be free from oppression and slavery. West Jersey Law, 1676.
For a moment, it seemed as though New Jersey might take a different path, but that moment passed. In 1702, the Jerseys surrendered control to the Crown, and by 1713, the laws grew far harsher. The enslaved could no longer hold property, and their masters faced strict limits on manumission.
The law made it a misdemeanor for a free person to purchase anything from a slave, and hence cut off a source of revenue to the more industrious slaves, who by their frugality often prepared something for sale. George Washington Williams.
Punishments were brutal, ranging from whippings to execution, and an import tax was laid upon every African brought ashore. The colony's leaders cloaked these measures in the language of order and morality, but the truth was simpler. They wanted money. Tax revenue from the slave trade lined colonial coffers, even as lawmakers publicly claimed they were encouraging industrious white settlers. Over time, the population numbers revealed the growing presence of slavery. In 1738, there were nearly 44,000 whites and just under 4,000 blacks in New Jersey. By 1745, the black population had risen above 4,600. Small in comparison to the South, yet undeniable. And within those numbers lay contradictions. In Quaker and German communities, enslaved people sometimes found themselves treated with relative kindness, even taught religion or offered education. But in other corners of the colony, they were reduced to little more than property, their lives bound tightly by fear and profit. New Jersey's story of slavery is one of uneasy tension, a place where moments of justice flickered, only to be smothered by the heavy hand of greed. It is a history both familiar and unique, reminding us that even in a colony often overshadowed by its neighbors, the struggle between freedom and bondage ran just as deep. Chapter 21, The Colony of South Carolina.
South Carolina has the unenviable reputation of being the only colony in North America where by positive statute the Negro was doomed to perpetual bondage. George Washington Williams.
South Carolina's history with slavery reads like a dark script written in law. No other colony in North America went so far as to declare, by statute, that slavery would be perpetual. From the moment the ink dried, every African, every mulatto, every mestizo or Indian, and their children, whether born or unborn, was chained to a lifetime of bondage. They were declared absolute slaves, reduced to property, bought and sold like cattle, inherited like land. The cruelty was not hidden in the shadows. It was written plainly into the law. Enslaved people were denied even the faint protection of a jury. Instead, 3 white freeholders could decide life or death with the stroke of a pen. If a black person so much as raised a hand against a white, the punishment was merciless. A first strike could mean a whipping, or the loss of an ear, or branding with a hot iron. A second brought mutilation, noses slit, faces burned. A third offense, death. Runaways faced a grim ladder of punishments that climbed steadily toward horror. The first attempt brought whippings, the second, branding, the third, the slicing off of an ear, and by the fourth, the sentence was castration. If the enslaved man died under the knife, the master would be compensated from the colony treasury. Even mutilation was a line item in the public accounts. Life itself carried a price tag. Killing a slave brought no murder trial, no gallows for the guilty. Instead, it required a fine, first £7, later raised to 50. To the lawmakers of South Carolina, a black life could be measured in money, and when that money was paid, the matter was closed.
The cruel and barbarous code of the slave power in South Carolina produced, in course of time, a reaction in the opposite direction. The large latitude that the law gave to white people in their dealings with the hapless slaves made them careless and extravagant in the use of their authority. It educated them into a brood of tyrants. They did not care any more for the life of a Negro slave than for the crawling worm in their path. Many white men who owned no slaves poured forth their wrathful invectives and cruel blows upon the heads of innocent Negroes with the slightest pretext. They pushed, jostled, crowded, and kicked the Negro on every occasion. George Washington Williams.
And yet, amid the cruelty, voices occasionally rose in protest. Ministers and reformers warned that such brutality was unchristian, odious in the eyes of all men who have any sense of virtue or humanity. But these words rarely shook the pillars of the system. Rice and indigo filled the planters' coffers, and wealth silenced conscience. Still, fear hung over South Carolina like a storm cloud. The masters knew that a people chained and beaten could not be expected to remain silent forever. Warnings spread that the enslaved, like gathering thunderclouds in summer, would one day break with fury.
Sudden and destructive insurrections were the safety valves to the institution of slavery. A race long and cruelly enslaved may endure the yoke patiently for a season, but like the sudden gathering of the summer clouds, the pelting rain, the vivid, blinding lightning, the deep, hoarse thundering, it will assert itself some day, and then it is indeed a day of judgment to the taskmasters. George Washington Williams.
This was slavery in South Carolina, brutal, calculated, and codified into the very bones of the colony. Laws turned human beings into property, cruelty into routine, and death into a fine to be paid at the treasury. But no matter how tightly the chains were fastened, the enslaved carried within them something the law could not extinguish, the quiet, smoldering fire of resistance. And in that fire lay the promise of a reckoning. Chapter 24, The Colony of Pennsylvania.
Have not these Negroes as much right to fight for their freedom as you have to keep them slaves? Francis Daniel Pastorius, 1688.
Long before Pennsylvania had a formal government, the land along the Delaware River was already alive with settlers, Swedes, Dutch, and then the English, all staking their claims. When William Penn arrived in 1681, he brought more than a vision of a colony. He brought an ethic. His conditions and concessions were clear. Disputes with Native Americans would not be settled by vengeance, but by a council, half white, half Indian. Justice, he believed, must be tempered with fairness, even in a land so wild and new. The institution of slavery, however, had already begun to creep into the colonies. In 1688, a man named Francis Daniel Pastorius dared to speak a truth that startled many. His words, carried by the Germantown Friends, were the first organized protest against slavery in America. He imagined a day when master and slave would sit equally, side by side.
When, from the gallery to the farthest seat, slave and slave owner shall no longer meet, but all sit equal at the master's feet. Francis Daniel Pastorius.
William Penn shared that vision. He sought to regulate the treatment of servants and enslaved people, to protect them from arbitrary cruelty, to ensure marriages were respected, and that they were freed properly at the end of their term. Penn wanted the law, not the whims of masters, to govern human lives, yet even he faced resistance. Many of his proposed bills failed, rejected by those more concerned with commerce than conscience.
The colonists did much to check the vile and inhuman traffic, but having once obtained a hold, it did eat like a canker. It threw its dark shadow over personal and collective interests and poisoned the springs of human kindness in many hearts. George Washington Williams.
Despite many efforts to quell its effects, slavery cast a long shadow over Pennsylvania. Laws tried to control it. The Society of Friends worked to mitigate its worst abuses, but the moral stain persisted.
It was not alone hurtful to the slave, it transformed and blackened character everywhere and fascinated those who were anxious for riches beyond the power of moral discernment. George Washington Williams.
The Quakers' guidance offered light and hope, yet it was a dangerous light, one that stirred in the enslaved both understanding and a desire for liberty. And so, in a land built on principles of faith and fairness, the tension of conscience and cruelty played out, a silent struggle between the ideals of freedom and the chains of human greed. It was a colony wrestling with its own soul, aware that the future of justice depended not only on laws, but on the courage to enforce them. Chapter 25, The Colony of Georgia. Georgia was the last English colony planted in North America, and from its very beginning, slavery became a battleground of ideals, economics, and politics. In 1732, the trustees for establishing the colony of Georgia set out to build a new society. Among their rules was one that would shock the South to come: slavery was forbidden.
Slavery is against the gospel, as well as the fundamental law of England. We refused, as trustees, to make a law permitting such a horrid crime. General John Oglethorpe, first governor of the colony of Georgia.
Another trustee echoed this moral stance.
Slavery, the misfortune, if not the dishonor, of other plantations is absolutely prescribed. Let avarice defend it as it will. There is an honest reluctance in humanity against buying and selling, and regarding those of our own species as our wealth and possessions. Trustee's Sermon, 1734.
Yet beneath these noble words, politics and survival shaped policy. Historians note that the ban on slavery was not born of humanity, but strategy. Georgia was to be a buffer, a line of white settlers defending the Carolinas from Spanish Florida and hostile tribes. Oglethorpe himself held slaves in South Carolina, revealing the tension between principle and pragmatism. As the colony grew, settlers pleaded for labor. James Habersham, once opposed to slavery, wrote that perhaps God had a higher purpose in permitting Negroes in Georgia, envisioning their potential conversion and salvation.
I once thought it was unlawful to keep Negro slaves, but I am now induced to think God may have a higher end in permitting them to be brought to this Christian country. Many thousands may embrace the gospel and thereby be brought into the glorious liberty of the children of God. James Habersham, supporter of Negro labor.
Struggling to make his plantations productive, one minister lamented,
"Had a Negro been allowed, I should now have had a sufficiency to support a great many orphans. Without expending above half the sum which has been laid out, Georgia never can or will be a flourishing province without Negroes are allowed." Reverend George Whitefield, 1748.
Petitions, debates, and clandestine hiring dragged the trustees into a long, bitter struggle. By 1749, the resistance weakened, and slavery was finally legalized under strict regulations. What began as a moral experiment became another colony under the dark shadow of human bondage. Slavery's influence swept through Georgia like an unstoppable tide, shaping its economy, society, and the lives of all who lived there, leaving a legacy that no noble declaration could erase.
The history of slavery in Georgia during this period is unparalleled and incomparably interesting. It illustrates the power of the institution and shows that there was no province sufficiently independent of its influence so as to expel it from its jurisdiction. Like the angel of death that passed through Egypt, there was no colony that it did not smite with its dark and destroying pinions. The dearest, the sublimest interests of humanity were prostrated by its defiling touch. It shut out the sunlight of human kindness It paled the fires of hope. It arrested the development of the branches of men's better natures and peopled their lower being with base and consuming desires. It placed the golden rule under the unholy heel of time servers and self-seekers. It made the church as secular as the change, and the latter as pious as the former. It was a gigantic system, at war with the civilization of the Roundheads and Puritans, and an intolerable burden to a people who desired to build a new nation in this new world in the West. George Washington Williams.
Slavery in the colonies was more than a system of labor. It was a force that shaped economies, laws, and lives, leaving a shadow over the foundations of a new nation. From the rigid hierarchies of Carolina to the moral experiments of Georgia and the cautious pragmatism of Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, the story of slavery reveals a complex web of human ambition, fear, and compromise. It was a system that denied freedom, exploited vulnerability, and tested the conscience of those who lived within it, yet it also sparked early debates about justice, morality, and the rights of all people. Understanding this history is not just about confronting the cruelty of the past, it's about seeing how these choices, compromises, and contradictions echoed through generations, shaping the country that would emerge. Slavery was a stain on the promise of liberty, and its legacy is a reminder of the cost of human oppression and the enduring struggle for freedom. Thank you for watching. Watch for part 3 of our series on History of the Negro Race in America by George Washington Williams, coming soon. And, if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to the channel, where we will bring you a new story each week.